estimated that between 5 to 20%, 20% probably being a little bit too high, but maybe 5%, maybe more, of the slaves who were brought forcibly, obviously, to the Americas were actually Muslim. And some of these were not just Muslim slaves, but they were actually scholars and judges in their home societies. So they were literate, they had written books, and when they settled in the Americas, they actually were able to set up networks and schools in some cases. So the first slave revolts against their slave masters were in Brazil and in Haiti in the 1500s and 1600s, and they were led by Muslim slaves. And these slaves were so unique that they actually sometimes embarrassed their masters because they were very obviously literate and cultured, and you couldn't demonize them in the way that they would often be demonized as basically, and this is how they were viewed, as animals, as subhuman. And in many cases, some of these slaves were actually given freedom and went on speaking tours across colonial America and the United States from the 1700s to the mid-19th century. Some of them became so famous that they were able to raise money and actually traveled back to Africa. We have stories of Muslim slaves who were brought to colonial America or the United States. When it was realized who they were released, or they were able to raise funds for their freedom, and then they took their wives and families, many of whom were not originally Muslim, back to Africa with them. And this memory of Islam remains in African American culture actually for so long that in the 1930s, when the United States government starts funding folklore projects to collect folklore traditions, they find that on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, there are actually small populations of African Americans who still practice Muslim traditions. So as late as the 1930s, these religious practices survive in Arabic names, in music, in religious traditions, in religious practices, in avoiding things like pork or alcohol. And of course, it's not like a perfect transmission because it's all muddled, but it was there as a memory, and I'm going to go back to that a little bit and talk about something that's very unique about the United States. The second thing, and this is just a map to give you a sense of where these slave populations were coming from. Most of them, again, are coming from West Africa, and they're going to Brazil, which had a huge number, obviously, and much smaller numbers were brought to the Caribbean and to the Americas, but that's just to give you a sense of it. And there was slavery by Muslims. I'm not trying to say that Muslims are like the nicest people in the world and everything we do is super cool. There's some pretty whack episodes in Muslim history as well, and this map very clearly shows that. But the weight of the numbers is obviously in one direction. And now, this is the even cooler part, and we're still in the prehistory phase. What ties together the Taj Mahal, Christopher Columbus, and the American flag? I'm not going to expect you to answer that because it's kind of complicated. When was the Taj Mahal built? Anyone? Want to guess? If you say 1975, you're wrong. I've gotten that before, so, just kind of heads up. Anyone want to guess? 1500. What's up? 1245. No, it is actually currently like 8:30. But nice try, dude. 1630 to 1650, which is after Jamestown and after Plymouth Rock and that whole business. The reason that's important is because the empire that built the Taj Mahal, the Mughals, right? Because that's my last name, in case you didn't make that connection. That's very awkward. The Mughals made their money and their empire after the discovery of the Americas. And the way that a lot of Muslims tell their history or imagine their history is that everything goes downhill around the 1240s or 1250s and that's it. But the Mughal Empire isn't founded until 1526, which is way after, right? Columbus and all that. And they make tons of money. They've got the stuff that everybody wants to buy. And the Europeans have gold and silver because of the Americans. And the Mughals are making crazy money, which is why they make the Taj Mahal. And this money keeps coming. And the trade that is built in this period from the 16 to 1700s is the birth of what we would call globalization on a really massive scale. Because European companies are sending ships to India and China, Indonesia, that whole region, to buy and sell. And these kind of networks become incredibly enduring. So, Yale University, right? The guy who founds Yale is a British guy of the Jewish faith who, in the late 1600s, makes a ton of money in India, and then when he makes a ton of money, he decides to retire in Connecticut where the land is cheap, and then he founds a university. He got his money out of India. And these connections were so deep and so profound that we have this. What is this? A little bit louder, come on. It's a British flag? British American flag. Who flew this flag? Someone say China? I'm gonna come down there and smack you. No, I'm just kidding. This flag was one of the earliest flags of the American Revolution, right? And we got rid of the whole Union Jack thing because who really likes England? Right? It was kind of awkward anyway. We just had a revolution and it was sort of like, right? We're not like Australians, right? We're like a real country. So I'm just kidding, you know. We put 13 stars in the canton where the Union Jack used to be. But you ever wonder where this idea came from of putting a flag in a canton like that and then having the stripes? That actually is not an American Revolutionary flag. That is the flag of the British East India Company from the 1600s. The influence of trade, and especially trade with India, which was a country that was in many areas ruled by Muslims, was so profound that it even, according to many scholars, shaped the flag of the United States. And we forget about that element of history, but it was there from the beginning. Hence, Americans are just Indians. So all of you who are brown can feel better about yourselves. And you wish you knew that when you were being picked on in high school for your weird accent. And it is a weird accent. Really, there's no justifying it. I'm just kidding. So, we do have such an awesome accent, don't we? It's like so much fun. The first country to recognize the United States after the Declaration of Independence is Morocco, a Muslim country. And Morocco recognizes the United States in 1776 or 1777 and sends diplomatic missions shortly thereafter. So America's first diplomatic relations with the world are actually with a Muslim country. And this comes back a few decades later because eventually, after we get our independence as a country, we find that our own trade routes to Europe and Africa are being intercepted by pirates coming out of Algeria and Tunisia. So America's first foreign war is actually with the pirates of what was called the Barbary Coast, right, in the early 1800s. And America wins the war, and the pirates are subdued, but this leads to a very famous peace treaty between the United States and these pirates, where the peace treaty itself says that the United States is in no way specifically a Christian country and therefore has no inherent animosity with a Muslim people. And this is very early obviously in American history, right? It's in the first few decades of American history. And what's crazy is those pirates that the United States fought, many of them were actually Europeans who had fled to North Africa under the same conditions that had led Europeans to flee to the New World, religious persecution. And many of them settled in North Africa and became pirates because there was basically an absence of government authority. And the absence of government authority is the perfect kind of segue to the next point, because as America gets wealthier and wealthier, and Europe becomes wealthier and wealthier, the balance of the world economy moves away from India and China towards the West, which sparks what we know of as the massive wave of immigration that brings Muslims to American shores outside the African American population. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So America is unique among all Western countries because America is the only Western country where a significant percentage of the Muslim population is American, indigenously, African Americans. There is no other Western country, and this is very unique if you think about it, there's no other Western country where a huge percentage, we're talking about 40 to 50% probably, of Muslims are indigenous to that country and have been in the country since before its founding. Because the first wave of African American Muslims are, as I said, those who were slaves and enslaved. And over time, their connection to Islam is diluted, but it's rediscovered in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s for a variety of reasons. One reason is because as the Jim Crow laws in the South make it really hard for African Americans to stay in the South, they migrate to the North and they lose their kinship networks. And they lose their connection to their churches. And they go through this process of rediscovering what it means to be a black man or a black woman. And this process opens the door to other religious traditions and historical memories. And at the same time, and this is something a lot of immigrant origin Muslims don't know, the first wave of Muslims who are Arab and Indian are coming into America. And we're talking about 1890s to 1920s. And some of them were actually involved in building mosques with African Americans. This is a part of immigrant Muslim history that's entirely unknown. In places like Milwaukee in the 1920s, there were Muslims from India who were actively proselytizing to and engaging with African American populations in the cities and building basically links that would grow into what we call the Nation of Islam, Black Islam, and all the different traditions within African American Islam. So that's one thing. Second thing is, the first wave of Arab Muslims comes to the United States in the 1880s, 1890s, and they settle in, of all places, North Dakota and Iowa. So, you know, this is called bad advertising, right? Or you got ripped off or something, right? Like, hey, I'll take you to New York. I'm like, are you sure this is New York? Like, it's very cold. And actually, that brings me up to like a really good kind of anecdote. Be careful what you name something, because it can screw with people's heads. I grew up in New England, right? What is New England, right? The 6 states in the Northeast. And for about 100 years after New England was first settled by English people, people assumed that it had the same climate as Old England. And so it kind of messed up. But basically, they brought people over with no preparation for incredibly hot summers and incredibly cold winters, and like 80% of them would die. And it took like a century for people to figure out that the climate was different. And this is true, because the assumption was always that, oh, this is just like another England. So people went totally unprepared. And it's hard to imagine how prepared you really could be, because you had no idea where you were going, and you had no idea if the winter weather you found one year was the norm, or was just a horrific freak accident, and everything would be better next year. So it took a long time for people to figure out, hey, you know what? This place is pretty damn cold. Or as my aunt found out when she showed up in New York City in a jacket in the summer, and we insisted to her that it was not London. She didn't believe us. So, in a sense, my aunt is English colonization. And now this is being videotaped, so I will not be invited to those parties anymore. So, these Arab populations settle in the Midwest and in the northern plain states because they work in factories. Ford, for example, has a need for mechanics, factory workers, so on and so forth. That's the first wave. The oldest continuously functioning mosques in America are located in, and it's of course a matter of debate like everything else in the Muslim community, because we never agree on anything, is either in North Dakota or in Iowa, and some people actually argue in South Dakota, but the fact of the matter is it's not where you think it would be. Another wave of Muslims are actually people who are brought to work in the Caribbean or in Louisiana, but who jump ship. Right? They come to work on ships. Many of them are South Asian. They come to work on merchant lines. They go back and forth. And the minute they drop anchor in New Orleans, a lot of them literally just jump off the ships and run away. And then they settle in the Deep South and they marry African Americans. That's, again, something that people don't know. That was one of the oldest links between the immigrant community and the African American Muslim community. Many of them settled there, and one of the reasons is there was nowhere else that they could be accepted, because they lived in pre-civil rights America, in Jim Crow America, where if you weren't white, you were basically you didn't really have any space to exist. So they naturally gravitated towards that population. And there are a lot of other populations we could talk about, but I don't have the time, and I don't want to kind of bore you. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, African American Islam has its sort of golden age, where it becomes an active part of the American mainstream. So you have figures like Malcolm X and so on and so forth. And that's the period when you really start to get huge numbers of African Americans becoming Muslim and making a massive impact on the national stage. And Malcolm X, there's just a new biography of Malcolm X that was published by a professor at Columbia, a guy named Manning Marable, who unfortunately, it was his life project, and he passed away 2 or 3 days before it was published. It's very tragic. I mean, he was an amazing teacher and mentor and intellectual in general. And it's called Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. You should totally pick it up if you can. It's also really heavy, so if you want to hit someone with it, you can do that too. It's like a life work. You know, when you say that an academic has put his life's work into something, that's a life work. And in this book, he talks about the fact that Malcolm X goes from being a local black nationalist leader to a civil rights leader to an international figure who makes multiple tours around the world and meets with world leaders from basically every corner of the planet because he becomes an international figure. And people forget how huge this period is in terms of the development of American Islam. Right? Muhammad Ali was probably one of the most influential and famous people in the world. And this is pre-satellite TV, this is pre all your gadgets and gizmos and everything. And he could go to the Philippines, or what was then Zaire, and have a fight against whoever it was, and everybody in the world seemed to know who this guy was. Because he was a symbol, like a global symbol of resistance and of genuine democracy. And this was kind of a golden age for Islam in America, because Islam in America was associated sometimes with negative things, yes, but many times also with a sense of liberation and striving towards cultural authenticity. This period begins to fade in the 60s and 70s for a lot of different reasons. We can get into that in the Q&A. I don't want to get into all the factionalism and stuff. But in 1965, and this is kind of where we can come to the present, American Islam has its big, I guess, flooding of what we call immigrant or immigrant heritage Muslims or recent immigrant Muslims, because the US government lifts visa restrictions on people coming from certain countries. So you get huge numbers of Muslims from Pakistan, India, what becomes Bangladesh, the Arab world, so on and so forth, and they come in big numbers, but many of them come as professionals. So they come, they do very well for themselves, and they're in a position socioeconomically for their kids to do well for themselves too, which is another unique fact about Islam in America. American Muslims are probably the best educated Muslim community in the world, easily, and also the most educated or most accomplished, shall we say, in that sense, community of all Western Muslims. Because of this wave, in part, and the openness of the American political system where you don't have an ethnic identity, and I'll talk about that more later. In terms of where American Muslims are now, because I want to get to some of the uglier stuff we've seen recently, there's either 3 million or 6 million Muslims in America. So make of that what you will. Right? Like nobody knows. Pew did a survey where they alleged that there were 2.5 million Muslims in America. I don't buy it. The reason I don't buy it is because there's about 700,000 to 800,000 Muslims living in New York City. And it's highly unlikely to me that 25 to 30% of the Muslims in America, or more than 30% of the Muslims in America, live in New York City. New York City is the biggest Muslim city in the Western Hemisphere in terms of number of Muslims. New York City's public schools are 12% Muslim. New York City's police force is about 10% Muslim. New York City has the most diverse Muslim community in the Western Hemisphere. And it's a community that spans basically everything you can imagine, from long-established immigrants and African-American Muslims. Malcolm X obviously he was killed in Harlem, he was based in Harlem, his mosque was in Harlem, as well as very new immigrant communities. Other major centers of Islam in America are places like DC and Chicago. There's huge Arab communities in Ohio, but we don't know the numbers. I would probably say around 4 to 5 million, but you know, again, it's kind of a guess. About 40% of Muslims in the United States are African American. It's a little bit complicated now because there are a lot of immigrants from Africa too, so Senegalese, Ghanaian Muslims, Ivorian Muslims, Sierra Leonean Muslims who are coming in very big numbers, and it's not really clear how you classify them because they are African American technically, but that's not what really we mean when we say African American, right? So that's kind of awkward. And about 30% are 35% are South Asian, right? That's like brown people from South Asia. About 20% are Arab, about 5% are white, Latino, and other small groups like Bosnians, Turks, East Africans, Indonesians. And it's interesting just to look at this for a second because in the world in general, about 65% of Muslims live Pakistan and East. Woohoo! Hey, yeah, too many people! Just like some of you are looking at me like, what is wrong with this person? Like, leave quickly. But it's interesting because the stereotype is always that the majority of Muslims are Arabs or the majority of Muslims are Middle Easterners. Actually, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Malaysia have, again, well over half the population of Muslims around the world. If you look at the 7 biggest countries by population of Muslims, only one of them is Arab, Egypt. The remainder are Indonesia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Turkey, and Egypt in there as well. So only one of those countries is Arab, 2 of them are Middle Eastern, and again, to kind of poke some of the stereotypes a little bit, all 7 of those countries are democracies. They're not perfect. Some of them are brand new, like Egypt. They have serious challenge. Go Egypt, Dunya. But in case you're Egyptian, seriously, like Egyptians are like so high on being Egyptian that the one like saving grace for the rest of us was that they lived under Mubarak, right? Like, so before you get too high on yourself, you have a whack dictator. But now that they have this revolution, they're like, oh, we invented civilization and democracy, right? Like, you clearly didn't, but every ethnicity is annoying when you get down to it. It's like a Seinfeld episode. But again, it's interesting because all these huge populations of Muslims who form, again, these 7 countries form over half the population of Muslims in the world, live in democracies. And they're active in democracies, and they have time and time again pushed as a majority for democracies. The American Muslim community is a drop in the bucket. If you're talking about a worldwide population of about 1.7 or 1.8 billion Muslims, about 25% of the world population is Muslims, so 1 out of 4 people. Of that, 5 to 6 million, 5 million, 4 million, wherever you want to put it, are American Muslim. We're like a really, really tiny amount, if you know what I'm saying. But we have an outsized impact. Again, think about people like Malcolm X or Muhammad Ali. Think about people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Barack Obama, for example, the first Muslim president. So I'm joking, like, in case you know. But I'm going to get in trouble when this one's like, I knew he was Muslim. I'm going to storm out. You know, I'm voting for Donald Trump. Seriously, Donald Trump? But sometimes I'm like, at this rate, I could run for president. Like, I have qualifications. Like, I ran an MSA once. I can do it. The reason I'm saying that is because it's important. We're very America-centric as Americans, right, for a lot of reasons, some of them legitimate, some of them because we don't really think about the world around us, but it's important to keep it in context. We are the most ethnically diverse Muslim community of any nation, very easily. Muslims are also the most religiously diverse community, ethnically diverse religious community in the United States. I have been to mosques where 40 languages are spoken. So that can also indicate to you some of the challenges that are faced by American Muslims in this incredible stew of diversity. There are Muslims from all over the world who are jammed together, who have never interacted with each other, and I can share some of that in a bit. In terms of some other statistics, in terms of the American Muslim community, if you break down religious communities in terms of gender disparity by income according to gender, American Muslims are the most equal. Because the degree of advanced degrees that are present among men and women are very close to equal. So actually, American Muslim women earn very close to what American Muslim men earn. And among all religious populations, we're sort of at the top of the bracket. Now again, that is very dissimilar to what exists in a lot of Muslim majority countries, but it is something that's unique and special about the American Muslim community. In terms of what's going on right now, and I know I'm flying through a lot, but I will save time for Q&A, because I know that's where some of the better questions come out. You've got two streams that form American Muslims. You've got recent immigrants and immigrant heritage Muslims, people such as myself. I was born in New England. My parents came in 1974 to Brooklyn. And you have African American Muslims. And they have had very different cultural experiences. And although they have been shaped by similar historical trends, they often don't have common memories. What this means is that it's very hard to see common ground and understand how to relate to one another. And this is a huge challenge for the American Muslim community, because the African American Muslim community went through the civil rights movement, went through Jim Crow, went through slavery, and in a sense, in every sense I guess you could say, was the force that changed and expanded democracy in America to include people of color. The Muslim community that is composed of immigrants, in large part, showed up after the civil rights era. So when immigrant heritage Muslims came, they came into a system that was radically open to people for the first time ever, arguably, and they were allowed in that sense to do very well for themselves, and that's not to minimize their educational accomplishments and the difficulty of coming, obviously from around the world, coming to a place and building something up. But the point is that American Muslims as immigrants have been very individually successful, but they have never been collectively tested. Because they have never faced, as a collective, discrimination in any large amount until the last few years. And hence, the major challenge that's facing the American Muslim community right now is this confusion as to what Islamophobia is. Why are people hating on Muslims? Because while people have faced ethnic discrimination and racial discrimination, it's kind of hard to say that there is systematic discrimination against Muslims when you were all sitting here at a university. You were able to get a university education, you were able to get good jobs. Those sort of things didn't exist for minorities 60 or 70 or 80 years ago at all. You were either allowed in or you were not allowed in. I'm at Columbia, right? So I'm not exactly suffering. These sorts of things were made available, and now that the American Muslim community is facing in many places systematic forms of discrimination, it's kind of a wake-up call. And I think in the long term what you're going to see happen in the American Muslim community are a couple things. The first is, in 2000, the immigrant community of Muslims decided to endorse George Bush. And the African American Muslim community said, that's stupid. There you go, right? Usually, when you make your first political decision, it's not a good one. This is why you should be allowed to vote when you're 18, and then take it back 4 years later. There should be like a, like a grace period, like that was a dumb idea. Because you're 18, what do you really know? You know a lot. You just can't drink. The destiny of the country is in your hands, but you cannot drink alcohol. That's just one of those things. But in 2008, about 90% of American Muslims voted for Barack Obama. That's huge. And in the last year and a half, increasingly, it's not just a case where Muslims chose to vote for Obama because they liked him as a candidate. It has become the case that whether they want to or not, Muslims are forced to identify themselves with the Democratic Party. There are a fair amount of Muslim Republicans and Libertarians and so on and so forth, but there is at the moment no room for them in the Republican Party. Those who exist in the Republican Party and been active in the Republican Party have basically been pushed out. And they've been dragged through the mud. I know cases of what's happened to some people, it's pretty bad. Therefore, you will see Muslims probably becoming a force within democratic politics in the way that Latinos are, African Americans are, and unions are. And this is probably just the trajectory in which it's going to go, because the only political force that is standing up for American Muslims as American Muslims are Democrats. Not all of them, but a sufficient number of them. That's the first thing. The second thing that means is that this is forcing American Muslim communities to work together for the first time, and it's forcing the comparatively wealthier immigrant community to realize that African American Muslims are already inside the system, they are more presentable and they're more accessible, and that's the reason why the two Muslim congressmen who have been elected to that office are African American and they're named Keith and Andre, other than the guy named Barack who's president.